I'm Mark Seddon. I'm here in Britain, but we are joined from guests in both the Middle East and North America, so from 3 continents today. I've been United Nations correspondent for Al Jazeera English television, and I've also worked for the former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and also for the President of the UN General Assembly, 73rd Division, Maria Fernanda. So really, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our 2 panelists today. I'm going to ask them some questions, then I hope you will too. And I'd like to introduce, first of all, Inès Abdel Razek. Inès is the Advocacy Director for the Palestinian Institute for Public Diplomacy. And previously, she held advisory and policy roles for the Union for the Mediterranean, the United Nations Environmental Programme, and the Palestinian Prime Minister's Office. She's a member of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, and today she joins us from Ramallah in Palestine. And I'd like to also introduce Miko Peled. Welcome, author, activist, and speaker. Miko grew up in Israel and at first followed a military career before teaching martial arts across the world and rediscovering his activism. And today he's known as one of the leading advocates of the BDS movement and believes in a peaceful single-state solution. And Miko, I believe you're joining us from Washington, D.C. Welcome to you both, and thank you very much for joining us. So really, just if I could begin, how is it that the Secretary of State for the United States essentially is saying the decision over annexation is Israel's and not the international community as a whole? I mean, what sort of signal is being sent, do you think?
Well, I think the signal that's being sent has been sent for a very long time. It's very, very clear. Israel gets away with everything it wants. And the Trump plan basically gave the presidential approval to the complete occupation of Palestine, to the establishment, well, more than the establishment, the approval of the establishment of an apartheid regime over all of historic Palestine, with no rights and nothing for Palestinians to gain, or no legitimacy to the Palestinian claims for liberation and freedom. So that's what the message is. And Iran is the political punching bag. You know, everybody shifts to Iran in order to not look at Israel. And the whole Iran thing, I think, is basically a solution.
Yeah, I mean, there is, and I'll come back to you in a minute in this, but I mean, there is this real issue now with international law, the power of international organizations, the efficacy of the United Nations and resolutions, the international order and multilateralism, if you like. And what it does appear is the most extraordinary thing is about to happen, with perhaps 30% of the West Bank to be annexed, the Jordan Valley, all of Jerusalem. That appears to be the intention. And yet, possibly because the focus is elsewhere at the moment on the pandemic, we don't hear a great deal from the European Union. We don't hear a great deal from the Arab League. Who can the Palestinians call upon in the coming months to come to their aid?
You know, the reality that you're describing is nothing new. I mean, it's like, again, like Inès said, the fact that now they're putting a legal face onto this expansion is really, in terms of the day-to-day life of Palestinians, irrelevant. The international community, international law, the European Union have been criminally negligent and collaborating with the state of Israel. And the result is what we see today. I mean, the state of Israel has no reason to comply with international law. It has no reason to comply with United Nations resolutions. None of these laws and none of these resolutions have any teeth, and nobody would dare to impose sanctions on the state of Israel, which is what is now, of course, required. Nobody dares to call to end the apartheid regime over Palestine that, again, like Inès was saying, has been in place for over 70 years. Nobody talks about that, and that's the only conversation that would bring about some sort of change and relief for the Palestinians.
Well, I mean, there you go. And I mean, we've got a question in. I think it's from Bill Goff. I'm not quite sure where Bill has been getting in touch from, but he asks, and I'm going to put this to you, Inès. I mean, what practical impact would the annexation of the West Bank actually make, since Israel effectively controls these territories in any event?
Yes, I think two things are important to still take into account if there is legal annexation. One is that, again, if nothing is done by the international community, that means not by saying something, because there has been some statements, by European states and, those that are believe in international law, but it's what can they do? It's if there is no accountability, like there has been no accountability for the past decades, effectively, this is the end of the international order. It's basically saying, international law doesn't exist, and which is what Secretary Pompeo said. He said it's up to Israel. It's actually not up to Israel. Annexation is forbidden under international law. But obviously, the Trump administration couldn't care less about international law. But effectively, if this goes unchallenged, and the EU said they would challenge it, but we're still waiting to see what they would do. Effectively, it would be the end. It would be just not only in Palestine, Israel. Think bigger. It would mean that the international community would effectively say, international law, it's not a valid framework. It's not valid anymore. So I guess what can be, the practical implications is more to emboldening, I think, moves that are extremely dangerous for Palestinians and for the existence of the Palestinian identity and Palestinian, presence on their land, which has been happening again, but it's just can worsen it. For example, displacement of
there, because I should just quickly say actually that Bill Goff is getting in touch from California. He's an old friend of Miko's. So nice to hear from you, Bill. But we've been ahead from Gianni. I think Gianni is getting in touch from Italy, and he wants to know, Inès, following on from your last question, what is there a prospect of greater unity amongst Palestinians themselves, the political parties? Are we far from unity amongst Palestinian political parties? Asked Gianni.
Yes, unfortunately, I think we're not close to a reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah. Fatah controlling the West Bank, Hamas controlling Gaza, and Israel is playing on that too, right? They are negotiating directly with Hamas. Someone shouldn't forget that there are direct talks. They say they're terrorists and so on, but they discuss. They have mutual interest at hand in keeping the status quo somehow as it is. So I think what's needed is clearly a complete shift within the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people. But the current political landscape is not very positive. I think the only positive thing we see is during this crisis that the Palestinian leadership within the authority, when dealing with health issues, with people's lives, and with the quarantine and so on, they seem to manage pretty well, and they actually have, some trust. They regain some trust of the people for managing the services within the small territories they control. So,
if I could just there, Inès, and go to you, Miko, on this. When it comes to Palestinian political unity, there is obviously ongoing controversy. President Abbas has been in office for a very, very long time. When is there going to be new, fresh political leadership at the top in Palestine?
I think we have to be careful not to view Palestinian leadership and the lack or not lack of Palestinian cohesion. We have to stop looking at it through the Israeli prism. We have to stop looking at it from the Israeli centrist perspective. I travel to Palestine all the time. And when I'm there, I speak to people throughout the entire country. In the Negev, in the south, Al-Jalil in the north, in Jaffa, in Jerusalem, in Ramallah, in Al-Khalil, in Hebron, throughout the entire country, activists who are the sort of leaders that are inspiring in every way. There's absolutely no lack of unity at all. Everybody speaks with one voice. Now, they don't have this political power, this what somebody called once the theatrics of power, like Hamas do in Gaza and the PLO have in the West Bank with some, semblance of security forces and stuff like that. But these are the activists on the ground. These are the opinion makers and the leaders in Palestine. And I'm talking about Palestinians. They all speak with the same voice. They all carry the Palestinian flag, and they all speak of a solution that calls for complete equal rights for Palestinians from the River Jordan to the sea, from the Lebanese border to the Gulf of Aqaba. It is across the board.
I mean, when I was at the United Nations, we would see President Abbas. He was seen very much as the representative of the Palestinian people. As far as the international leaders are concerned, this is the guy they're dealing with. And I hear what you say about public opinion and activism and campaign and all the rest of it. But do you not think there's still got at the top there is the leadership is sclerotic? It needs changing if there is to be a real fight back to these plans for isolation.
I think the Palestinian Authority, in terms of moving forward in the liberation of Palestine, is completely made itself irrelevant, and not only to its own. It's existing in some very difficult conditions, but to the larger issue of Palestine, the liberation of Palestine, the Palestinian Authority is completely irrelevant. And I don't think Abu Mazen represents anyone. I don't think he even thinks. I'd be surprised if he thinks he represents anyone. Right. And so the whole entire concept of the PA is again looking at Palestine through an Israeli prism, through an Israeli perspective. Otherwise, it has no relevance.
I'm going to come back to both of you on another question in a minute about the coronavirus, but just one finally on the annexation plans. I mean, still at the United Nations, still at the EU, globally, people talk about the two-state solution. They talk about Oslo, but really, what on earth can be said to be if this annexation goes ahead in July? I mean, who can seriously actually stand by that position, and what will it take to change that at the United Nations, for instance? And Inès, I'll come to you first on that, and I'll come back to you, Miko. Where does this leave Oslo? Where does this leave the two-state? You'll probably say, well, it's been dead in the water forever. But in terms of international language, that's still, as you know, this is what everybody says.
Yeah, I think there is different things here. There is the peace process. There is no peace process. I think the idea that there are prospects for negotiations. I mean, Israel has not been interested. They don't have any strategic interest into negotiating whatsoever. And so the Palestinians have been, making compromise after compromise after compromise. 67 borders, 2 states, sharing the resources. I mean, and effectively, they just demand these parameters that have been repeated again and again in the Arab Peace Initiative and so many peace initiatives. But the Israelis have never wanted that because they have the control. So we have to first abandon this idea that there can be negotiations right now. The only way is accountability. And so it's to look at what accountability means, because if there is no cost for Israel on the occupation, and there is no cost on annexation, remember that Jerusalem was annexed in 1967. Nothing happened. Jerusalem is already annexed, right? Israel claims it's the united capital, but nothing happened. Same with settlements growing. Settlement construction is illegal, yet they have flourished and they continue to flourish. So again, Israel has not taken no responsibility and has not felt any cost for it. So I guess today it's about, the international community. The only thing they can do is support some accountability measures. And that means effectively sanctions. And when we say sanctions, it's not something outside existing rules and procedures. It means effectively not, trading with the settlements. It means forget to procure and provide services for Israeli, all the Israeli ministries and Israeli administrations and companies that surveil and that effectively violate human rights. It's supporting ICC investigation. It's all of these tools that effectively have never been put in place because, as Miko said, there is no political will. And I just want to answer quickly the question that came back twice is, Israel's talking points and narrative is also that they help greatly the Palestinians, but effectively under occupation and the occupation law, they have a responsibility towards Palestinians' lives and towards Palestinians' health. They have not taken that responsibility. They have subcontracted it to the PA. So for so many years, the PA has basically been the subcontractor of Israel's occupation. So Israel has not the burden to deal with the Palestinian population. They have enclosed Gazans into a terrible blockade, and they don't have to deal with them. And actually, they have no intention of annexing Gaza. They would prefer that all Palestinians are locked there, and they don't have to deal with Gaza, yet controlling borders and sea, etc. So again, I think from a Palestinian perspective, people, as Miko said, want rights. I don't think everyone wants one state. I think some people still want two states. I personally want one state, but I think that we should recognize some people want two states, but they want rights. And effectively, equal rights means having equal rights in a regime that systematically discriminates on the basis of whether you're Palestinian or Jewish.
Well, Miko, if I can come to you, the people have been campaigning, and people such as yourself on the BDS campaign, the divesting sanctions campaign, have come under a great deal of criticism. It does appear that that there are very loud and powerful voices out there who do want to try and muzzle campaigners for Palestinian rights. So one of the questions that is coming through from the people viewing this is that how can you pull all of the voices together? So all the voices advocating Palestinian freedom, all the different groups, how can you pull them all together to make them more effective and also perhaps a bit more, a bit more resolve to defend themselves when they come under terrible attack?
I think we have to differentiate here between two different parts of the Palestinian question, or the two different conversations here. One conversation takes place in the United Nations, the international community that you mentioned, and they all refuse to recognize that Palestine has been occupied since 1948 and has been subjected to a brutal apartheid regime. And granted, the taking of Palestine was in two parts. Most of it was taken in 1948. And then the rest was taken in 1967. Inez mentioned Jerusalem. West Jerusalem in 1948 was subjected to a 100% ethnic cleansing. Not a single Palestinian person, not a single Palestinian family was allowed to remain. Where was the international community then? We're asking, where's the international community now that Israel is about to take, this Area C, which is a weird definition of particular parts of Palestine. Where were they in 1948 when Israel expelled close to 1 million people and committed such atrocities that the pages of the books are burning from horror? So where was the international community then? It's in the same place today where it was then. They do not care. That is one conversation. The other conversation is the conversation that takes place on the ground among activists. And when I say on the ground, I don't necessarily mean in Palestine, but a great deal of it is taking place in Palestine. And that is precisely the question you asked. How do we all work together in order to make those voices heard? And that's exactly what our job is. That's what I see. What I do is to bring those voices out. When you talk to activists, again, in the Nakab, you have hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who are citizens of the state of Israel who live without access to water, who live without access to electricity, who live in terrible overcrowding conditions because they're not allowed to build. And of course, now we've got the coronavirus, which I know we'll talk about in a minute.
We will get onto that. I'll just come in there, Miko, if I may, because we've been talking about bringing campaigning groups together. It wasn't that long ago, of course, that there was quite a powerful peace movement within Israel amongst Israelis, and I just wonder, and a lot of people wonder about all of this, when there is such patent injustice taking place and seismic events that many Israelis will feel very uncomfortable with and not want. What are the prospects for closer collaboration and building up links again with the Israeli peace movement, and in fact that becoming stronger? And I'll ask you, Miko, on that.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say. The other conversation is the conversation among activists. Now, you either recognize the right of Israel to exist as an apartheid regime or you reject it. The Israeli peace movement, or what used to be an Israeli peace movement, never rejected the apartheid regime. It was a Zionist-based, Zionist-centric peace movement that said, we have all the rights and we are quite willing to allow the Palestinians limited rights under conditions that we set. Now, when they had to choose between peace and Zionism, they all fell on the side of Zionism. That's why they vote for people like Benny Gantz, and who is a war criminal and a racist. That is the Israeli peace movement.
I'm talking about now. What happens now? I mean, what can be done now, given that we're looking at a possible annexation of great swathes of the West Bank in July? There are genuine security risks. There must be amongst Israelis as well. A lot of people still want to have a peaceful solution, and they are not happy with what Netanyahu and Gantz are doing. Is trying to rebuild those links, perhaps. What can be done? I mean, but taking into account what people have done in the past and what have you, but we're looking at the situation now. What can be done now to build new alliances?
Well, I don't accept the premise that that within Israeli society there is a voice for that. When we look at the results of the last 3 elections and the elections before that, actually, we see the opinions of the state of Israelis. Israelis, by and large, support the annexation, support the apartheid regime, support the violence. When the Israeli army is bombing Gaza and murdering thousands of civilians, where are the Israeli voices? Everybody stands behind it. The only support that we can rely on is, of course, the wonderful work the Palestinians are doing within, the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which is, I believe, the most powerful call, the most powerful tool that we have, and people around the world, people of conscience, activists, and others who are, churches and people, faith groups, peace groups, and so forth, that must demand that this issue become front and center, and that we reject this notion that Israel has a right to not only exist, but mandate and force Palestinians out.
Now, of course, I mean, we've alluded to this throughout. I mean, COVID-19, the pandemic, it's already having an effect in the Middle East. And I think, according to WHO, on the 22nd of April, I think it will be about 350 people infected in the West Bank. 2 people have died. There's been a case announced yesterday of COVID-19 in one of the camps in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. Now, of course, this is a health crisis that is yet to truly take root in the Middle East and the global South as well. And everybody's hoping that, of course, it doesn't. But it becomes this kind of all-embracing issue that pushes everything to one side. Unless we're all very, very careful. But the question I'm getting from Barbara Milano, Barbara writes in, and she says that the Israeli UN ambassador, UN ambassador, Mr. Danon, has claimed that Israel has donated generously to protect Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza from the coronavirus pandemic. And the Palestinian Authority and Hamas have falsely accused Israel of deliberately obstructing Palestinian efforts to combat the virus. Do either of you, Inès, first of all to you, I mean, what is this? Is there any cooperation? I mean, what duty of care and responsibility does an occupied power have in any event in the West Bank and in particular in Jerusalem?
I mean, as I said earlier, and I want to come back to Miko's points on the national struggle, but
well, we can do that, but let's get on to the coronavirus. And just...
Yeah. I mean, again, as I said before, I think it's a false narrative to say that there is cooperation. I think there is the Israelis that control effectively borders, supplies, resources, and then the PA that can just, expect that they can have some material in what they need to be accepted by Israel. So, Israelis have been squeezing Palestinians' lives and livelihoods for so long. In Gaza, the blockade, 13 years of blockade. I don't know if you imagine a lockdown, imagine worse than a lockdown, and imagine that for 13 years. That's what Gazans have been living under. And so now you see on the Israeli authorities' social media that they're really very generous by letting some trucks in and out, but they've effectively destroyed and bombed the electricity infrastructure, the schools, the hospitals. So everything is a humanitarian crisis because of the political situation. And the Israeli authorities then come and say how generous they are into providing this aid, but it's their responsibility under international law. It's their responsibility to provide for the Palestinian people in occupied territory. That's a fact. I think, again, going back to Miko's points on the national struggles, I think we need to move away from thinking that there is these two equal parties that don't agree with each other, and also from this state-centric issue. Let's look, and again, let's take a more intersectional perspective or a more global perspective, and see what people live under, what kind of system. Today, if you're a Palestinian worker in Israel, you work, you've been asked to work during the crisis, during the COVID crisis, because your work is essential, but effectively you were not tested, you don't have access to Israeli security, social security, and to the same health care that the Jewish community have. If you're a Palestinian in the West Bank, you're under military law, and the Israeli settler next door is under civilian law. So if you raise a Palestinian flag on a hill, you can go to a military court. If an Israeli settler is injuring a Palestinian, actually attacks have really increased during this crisis because people are on lockdown and quarantine. They are never indicted. So I think we need to look at the inherent institutional and systemic inequalities that people live under, and this is what we need to fight against. And so, on the question of the struggle and how can we move forward for freedom effectively and rights, it's about what are the different people who believe in the same values. I don't think, as Miko said, there is a peace camp in Israel, but there are a very tiny margin of people who believe in the same values that we do for freedom, equal rights. They work in NGOs that are effectively also very criminalized by the state. They are obviously the people in the joint list, and they're all Palestinians living in Israel. If you see the joint list, they got 15 seats in the elections because also some Jewish people voted for them, and these are the Jewish people.
Actually, on the joint list, David Prum in the United States is asking, can this become a joint party? The joint list, can it become a party that brings people together from all communities? Could that become an effective political vehicle and choice for people?
Yeah, I mean, what is clear today is that the only people in these past elections that called for effective democracy and equal rights for all is the joint list, is the Palestinian list. And so, yes, I think the joint list is open for Jewish people to join. But as Miko said, I think we have to see the reality of society. More than 50% of people support annexation. And so let's say that obviously there is a tiny majority of people who believe in equal rights. And I think these people should join forces with the joint list, because the joint list effectively believes in Palestinian self-determination. And until Palestinian self-determination is denied by Israelis, whether, they are, everywhere in the territory, that effectively we won't find a solution. So yes, I do believe that they are a very important constituency for the struggle moving on.
Miko, can I ask you the same question?
Yeah, well, I'm going to echo exactly what Inès said. I mean, this is, I think the joint list have exceeded everybody's expectations, including their own. First of all, by the number of seats they were able to get in the Knesset, and the number of the high rates of voting among the Palestinian citizens of Israel, and the number of Israeli Jews, again, like Inès said, that share these values of equality and rights and voted for the joint list. And I think they've also exceeded everybody's expectations in their parliamentarian work. In other words, they are the only parliamentarians in the Knesset that are not dealing with trying to get into the coalition, trying to get a seat, trying to get a job. They are actually in the committees, trying to get money to poor people, trying to help small businesses, trying to help people who are sick, and on top of that, raising the issue of the horrific conditions of Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, like I said earlier, in the Nakab and in other parts of the country, where they live in such conditions where which are almost invite the coronavirus to come in and take over and take people's lives. So I agree, they have exceeded everybody's expectations, and I think they definitely, and also the fact that they're a coalition. It's not a single party; it's a coalition. You've got socialists, and you've got liberals, and you've got Islamists, and it's a coalition of different movements, of different parties, which united in order to accomplish a particular goal. And that's precisely, I think, the model that the Palestinian struggle needs to take. It has nothing to do with whether we're socialists or religious people or people of faith. What's important is that we reach the goal, again, which is a question of rights, equal rights for Palestinians.
Well, thank you, Miko. I mean, we just somebody called Shubda has been in touch. I'm not quite sure where Shubda's calling from, but the question there is essentially, can we possibly trust the facts when it comes to COVID-19 in the West Bank and Gaza? I mean, I was quoting figures from Delhi, calling in from Delhi in India. I mean, I was quoting the latest figures of the World Health Organization, of course, an arm of the United Nations, which neatly leads me on to just the final area for us quickly to discuss until next time, and that is the role of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, the cuts there have been to its budget. Also, of course, the cuts to the WHO's budget from the Trump administration. It does look as though many of these UN agencies that were set up originally to deal with short-term issues have now become part of the permanent landscape in Palestine, as the occupation has lasted for decades. But tell me, if you both can, I'll start with you, Inès. I mean, the pushback on the UN agencies that provide all sorts of very basic, important aid. Is the hole being filled by other member states of the UN? I mean, or can you actually know, are these budget cuts really beginning to bite? Are they having an effect?
Yes, I think UNRWA has suffered tremendously in the past years. Obviously, some donors are stepping in, but I think it's very important to say again that I think it depends where you are, but the UN agencies, especially for basic services, play a tremendous role in Israel-Palestine. And again, it's Israel who controls. I mean, today, again, I read that, trucks have been entering the West Bank through the KOGA, through the Israeli authorities. So even the UN agencies, have to obviously have the authorization of the Israelis to provide aid to the Palestinians. And what the United States and the Israel have been trying to do with UNRWA is obviously destroy UNRWA, because they want to question the right of refugees, the right to return of refugees. So effectively for them, it's a political question beyond, it's not an administrative question, as they said. So they have lost a lot of budget, and refugees across the world, including Palestinian refugees, are the most vulnerable people to COVID. And so UNRWA is doing an enormous job. They have a new head that has been appointed early April. And, he's appealing, I think he's working hard into appealing to other member states to step in. And the same with WHO. I think what WHO does is enormous. But again, we are here with a layer of COVID is interdependent with occupation, where, the UN agencies have to step up where, if the Palestinians would be sovereign, or if there would be a system where everyone would have access and would have their rights upheld, the UN agencies wouldn't have to fill that gap. So I think this is where we are today. And especially, I think for Gaza, I think the situation is terrible, but I hope that UNRWA and the donors, will step in. I think the EU has stepped in, and others, to fill the gap that the US has left.
Miko, if I could put the same question briefly to you, and then we'll
Sure.
begin to bring things to an end.
Sure. I'd like to say, if anybody wants to see, get a really good feeling of the kind of work and the kind of sense that Palestinians have towards UNRWA, read Ghassan Kanafani's short stories. He talks about what it's like to live in the camps, and and receive these, this charity from UNRWA. It's a great description of how what it's like to be on the receiving end. But again, I'll echo what Inès said. The denying UNRWA money is a political move, because the whole narrative, or the whole political narrative here, is to deny the existence and the rights of refugees. And so that is precisely why the United States stopped funding, and that's precisely why Israel demanded that. They want to pretend like the refugees don't exist. And of course, the reality is that, fine, you want to take the funding away, allow them to go back to their homes. In other words, it's an equation here. If you want to take away the funding, if you want to cancel UNRWA, if you want to stop providing the relief for Palestinians, who really have no reason to be poor because education levels are very high. They're only poor because Israel is banning them from return. Allow them to return to their homes, and they can, live productive lives back in Palestine, where they want to go anyway. But that's really not what they want to do. They want to destroy the Palestinian narrative. They want to destroy the refugee issue, which of course is central, as we know, to the Palestinian issue, to the Palestinian question. So I think that and to begin with, again, I go back to Ghassan Kanafani's story. The amount of relief that actually reached Palestinians still kept Palestinians in such terrible poverty, in such terrible conditions, that it really wasn't doing all that much. It's not like Palestinians were driving expensive cars. They were living in horrible conditions, even today, of course, in refugee camps in and around Palestine. So again, it's a political question, and the only way to move beyond this and to resolve this is a political solution to the question of Palestine.
Well, that yes, right back to the political solution, as ever, the political solution for Palestine, the increased recognition of Palestine by many member states of the United Nations. But as we draw this to a close, I mean, some quite fantastical things are happening that are deeply shocking. Nobody could have predicted 2 or 3 years ago that a United States administration would be relocating its embassy to Jerusalem, would effectively be giving the green light for annexation of whole swathes of West Bank Palestinian territory. But amidst all the gloom, if both of you, and I'm going to start first of all with you, Inès, has a message of hope, really, what would that be? What can people concretely do, not just in Palestine, but across the world? What can people do to push the issue of the Palestinian people first and foremost? And so there is a real challenge to these annexation plans.
And let Miko talk about BDS, but I would say, I think, as a word of conclusion, that it's very important to change the narrative. I think the way people think and talk about Palestine and Israel is very much framed by this past 30 years of peace process and Oslo and so on. I think we need to really deconstruct that, and we need to see, especially now with the COVID crisis, I think it helps to understand where are there structural inequalities, where is there structural violence, where are they institutions that effectively discriminate peoples over others. And I think this is what we need to fight against. We need to fight for equal rights, and we need to fight to make sure that Palestinians have the same rights and freedom as the Jewish people in Israel, Palestine, in historic Palestine, between the river and the sea. And I think, again, not being caught by this idea that whether it's through Israeli elections or through PA elections or whatever institutional mechanism is here already, that won't solve this problem, that won't lead us to our goal. So I think there is a lot of people on the ground in Palestine, a lot of solidarity movements, a lot of advocates outside that do believe that a rights-based approach, human rights and freedom are the way forward. And there is a lot of ways to help, and even just reframing that narrative, and presenting it as a fight against apartheid, a fight for rights, already will be, I think, tremendously help change the power balance, because it's about power shift at the end of the day.
Thank you, Inès. Miko?
Yeah, I agree completely. And I would only add that if people around the world want to support the Palestinian cause, they need to demand from their elected or unelected officials, whichever the case may be, state by state, to demand sanctions against the state of Israel, to boycott the state of Israel, to divest from the state of Israel, to send home all the Israeli ambassadors back to Tel Aviv and do what South Africa did, which is downgrade their diplomatic mission in Tel Aviv. This is the only way it's done. I mean, we have a model. We had a model in South Africa. We saw how the international community helped Blacks in South Africa bring down apartheid. The exact same thing needs to be done today. But like Inez was saying, it's all about changing the narrative. We need to stop legitimizing Israel. We need to stop saying that Israel is a legitimate entity. We need to deal with it as an apartheid regime that is violent and brutal, which of course we know. And we need to look at international law in terms of crimes like genocide and apartheid and ethnic cleansing, which are well defined by international law and which Israel has been engaged from the very beginning for over 7 decades. And this is how we move this issue forward. It's not going to be, again, like Inès said, it's not going to happen using the institutions that exist today. The solution for the question of Palestine cannot be done by trying to rehash what's already been done. It's not about two equal sides that can't get along. It's about the destruction, the ethnic cleansing, the imposition of an apartheid regime upon Palestine and Palestinians, and that is what needs to be reversed. And the beauty of the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions is that this is in the demands of the call for BDS, ending the military occupation which exists, demanding equal rights between Israelis and Palestinians, and allowing the refugees to return to their homes.
Just one final thought for you both. I mean, of course, what you're talking about is what needs to happen, is what you believe needs to happen amongst Palestinians and the international support that Palestinians have around the world. But all things are invariably influenced by outside events. The Trump administration has obviously aided the Israeli government in their plans to annex the West Bank. But we have an election in the United States in November. It's just possible that there could be a different president. You might say there may not be a great deal of difference with the election of a different president, but you could also say that a different president might actually abide by international law, and we wouldn't have the unilateralism that we've had from this current president. So, I mean, there can be international events that can help. Would you not agree?
Yeah, I would say definitely there is opportunities, and as Miko said, anything you will do to fight for freedom and rights, you will be called either anti-Semitic or terrorist. So we're here also. And everyone should feel free to contact me as well and Miko for resources, because we need to fight back these attacks. And I think, yes, the U.S. elections. I mean, unfortunately, Bernie Sanders is not anymore a candidate. I think a lot of Palestinians had hoped because he's the first one who really explicitly called for conditioning military aid to Israel, and this is what needs to happen. Conditioning military aid, conditioning corporations, stop trade, all these effective sanctions that they should be accountable for violating, again, human rights and international law for so many years. So we hope that Biden could adopt some of these measures. I'm not so hopeful, but let's see how the campaign goes. Well, look, we're not so hopeful he wins either, but yeah, I think everyone should continue and as Miko said, I think hold their own elected officials accountable for questioning the relationship with Israel.
Well, okay. I mean, in fact, Inès, you actually briefly referred to how people can get in touch with you and follow you. I'm going to just say that you can, for Miko, MikoPeled.com. That's correct, isn't it? MikoPeled.com. People can. Yeah,
you can find everything there. Yes.
You can find everything there. Inès, where can people find you?
On Twitter, Inès Abdel Razek. Also, feel free to message the PIPD, the Palestine Institute for Public Diplomacy. I will see we're a small team, so we can see the messages. And obviously, I'll be happy then to share my private email with any people who get in touch.
Well, look, thank you. And thank you to both of you. Thank you in particular because we had those earlier teething problems. The sound and what have you. But I think it's proved to be a very, very interesting discussion. This is only the second Palestine deep dive. It's been terrific. It's been a great privilege to have both of you with us and joining us. So thank you. And I'd also like to thank the team that have helped put this together. And to say until next time, that's all from us here at Palestine Deep Dive. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you.
Thanks, Inez. Bye-bye.